Once you earn your sport pilot certificate, you'll have the ability to fly a lot of different kinds of aircraft. But sport pilots also have a lot of restrictions that you need to know about. Not only could you get asked about these restrictions on your check ride, but after you become a sport pilot, you'll want to remember these because you want to keep those privileges for longer than 5 minutes. So let's look at some of the things you need to know as a sport pilot. When we're looking at the privileges and limitations for sport pilots, the main regulation we need to start with is FAR 61 Subpart J. But before we discuss that, I briefly want to point out that there are a lot of different sections of the Federal Aviation Regulations. In fact, there are a bunch that you won't find in the FAR AIM or even in Flight, so it can sometimes be tough to find what you're looking for. Now, I plan on discussing most of the regs you need to be familiar with as a sport pilot, but the two main regs you should have bookmarked are Part 61 and Part 91. Part 61 deals with the certification of pilots, and Part 91 deals with general operating and flight rules. And knowing that makes it a little bit easier to find the regs that you're looking for. If you know where to start, that can make things a lot easier on the oral exam. Because if the DPE asks you a question and you don't know the answer, start by asking yourself, is this a pilot certification question or is this an operating or flight rule? Then at least you know which regulation to start with, and the privileges and limitations of a sport pilot are going to fall into the pilot certification category. So this is where we want to start digging for that information. Okay, so let's look at Subpart J. This is a subsection for sport pilots, and FAR 61315 is where we'll find the sport pilot privileges and limitations. And it's important to note that these are the things that you can and can't do as the pilot in command. Well, what the heck does that mean? If you ever find wording like this in the regulations where you aren't sure on the exact definition of something, you can find a lot of answers in Part 1 of the Federal Aviation Regulations. This is where we find the definitions and abbreviations, and according to FAR 1, we see exactly what it means to be the pilot in command, which we often abbreviate PIC. The PIC has the final authority and responsibility for the operation and safety of flight. This means that you are the person responsible for everyone and everything on board the aircraft. And this is something that you need to take very seriously. It also means that you have the final say on what happens aboard the aircraft. So, if you're flying with your wife and she wants to eat Chick-fil-A again and you don't want to, you get the final say. I'm just joking about that because we all know what happens when you disagree with the home base FAA officer. But in all seriousness, once you get your license, you will be the expert. If you think you need to turn around and go home because the weather's getting too bad, turn around and go home. It's okay to get input from the passengers, but you need to make the decision. I like to get my passengers involved in looking for traffic, birds, and other stuff like that. It gives them something to do, and it also lets them see that I'm actively trying to keep everyone from dying. But ultimately, I'm responsible for making sure that they're safe. In fact, if we have an in-flight emergency, as the pilot in command, I've got a lot of options. According to FAR 91.3, in an in-flight emergency requiring immediate action, the pilot in command may deviate from any rule of this part to the extent required to meet that emergency. So during an emergency, we can actually break the rules, and that's pretty crazy to consider. But you might be wondering what kind of trouble we can get in for doing that. Well, if you look at the next line, it says that if we deviate from one of these rules, we only need to send in a written report upon the request of the administrator. And I think this is important to think about because if the lives of your passengers are at stake and you break the rules because of an emergency, the FAA might not even ask you why you broke them. Okay, so let's look back at the definition of the pilot in command. The PIC has been designated as the pilot in command before or during the flight. This just means that if you and your buddy both have your sport pilot's license, or if he has his private certificate, you need to be clear who is the pilot in command of the aircraft. Here's a good briefing I like to use when I'm flying with friends who have their private or sport pilot's license. To change the controls, my plan is to verbalize the change of controls 3 times. If you hear 2, the controls have changed, but we'll shoot for 3 today. Now, if we lose comms for some reason, you can tell me that you want me to take the controls by pushing the rudder pedals 3 times, and I'll shake the yoke 3 times to indicate that I've taken control. Push to pass and shake to take. But if that's so confusing, we can raise up our headset and just yell over the engine noise if we have to. If there's any confusion, just make sure you know who's flying the aircraft. And let's say whoever has physical control of the aircraft is the pilot in command at that time. Last but not least, the pilot in command must hold the appropriate category, class, and type rating, if appropriate, for the conduct of flight. And this just means that if you have your airplane single engine land category and class rating, You can't be the PIC in a single engine C or multi engine land airplane or something like that. There's nothing that says you can't be at the controls, but you can't be the pilot in command. Now, here's the cool thing for you sport pilots. You do not have to take a check ride if you want to operate in a different category or class. You can't fly quite as many aircraft as someone with a private certificate, but according to FAR 61321, if you want to operate as the pilot in command in a new category or class of aircraft, all you have to do is get trained by an instructor, have that instructor endorse you to take a proficiency check, and then a different instructor will give you the proficiency check and will give you the endorsement for that new rating if he feels that you're safe and proficient to operate in that new aircraft. As you can see, this can be a huge cost saving since you don't have to pay $1,000 to some random DPE to take a check ride. But anyway, once you're properly certificated to act as the pilot in command, you're going to have a lot more authority and responsibility as the PIC. But technically, during your training, unless you're going solo, you're not the PIC, but you need to start acting like the PIC as soon as possible during your training. Now, this is going to be tough for some of you who are introverts, but it's important for you to be assertive when you're talking on the radios, when you're doing checklists, and when you're briefing a passenger. You're going to make a lot of mistakes in the beginning, and that's totally normal. But I would way rather have a student be assertive and make a mistake than to be more laid back. It's much easier to catch mistakes and correct them early with assertive students. In addition to that, as the pilot in command, you also need to start getting used to giving your passenger a pre-flight briefing. Even though sport pilots are only allowed to carry one passenger, and while you might not have a passenger with you during any of your training flights, it's the PIC's responsibility to brief their passengers about the safety equipment on the aircraft and how to exit the aircraft if there's an emergency. This would be like the location of a fire extinguisher, having your passenger put on their seatbelt, and explaining how to put on the seatbelt and other stuff like that. I'll discuss seatbelts and shoulder harnesses more in another episode. Okay, now that you know what the pilot in command is, let's look at your privileges and limitations as the PIC if you're a sport pilot. First of all, you cannot act as the pilot in command of an aircraft that is carrying passengers or property for compensation or for hire. You're also not allowed to operate as the pilot in command and get paid at all. In fact, the regulation specifically says that you also cannot further a business. If you want to fly over somewhere and meet a customer for lunch or show off some new business product, you have to have at least a private pilot certificate to do that. That being said, the FAA will be allowing a few small exceptions to this under the new Mosaic rule, and you'll have to do a little more research on your own if you want more information on this. But probably the most common way to do this is to earn your instructor certificate with a sport pilot rating. If you want more information on that, you'll want to check out FAR 61 Subpart K, where it outlines most of the stuff you need to know if you want to make money as an instructor with a sport pilot rating. Now, here's something important to remember. Sport pilots can only carry one passenger, and while you cannot charge them for the flight, they can pay up to half the operating costs for that flight. You, as the sport pilot, must pay your pro rata share. This simply means that you can split the cost of fuel, oil, airport expenses, and rental fees with that one passenger, but everything else is on you. Okay, in addition to this, you cannot fly at night with a sport pilot rating. Now, under the new Mosaic rule, the FAA is now allowing sport pilots to fly at night if they do a couple things. First, you must get your third class medical. You can also use basic med instead if you qualify for that, but that's why basic med is a part of this sport pilot training. Then you have to get training from an instructor and get endorsed to fly at night. But once again, you can't just go fly without these two things. You have some work to do before you can just jump in and go. Next, you're not allowed to fly in Class Alpha airspace, which is obvious because you have to be IFR rated to fly up there. And sport pilots cannot earn an IFR rating. In addition to this, sport pilots are not allowed to operate in Class Bravo, Charlie, or Delta airspace or any airspace with a control tower. In fact, I think there's like one or two airports left in the US that have control towers in Class Echo airspace, so you can't fly in there either. But once again, you can get trained to operate in this airspace. FAR 61325 explains what you need to do to be able to fly in this airspace, and it's super simple. All you have to do is get properly trained and get endorsed. It's no big deal to earn this privilege, and I think it's well worth it because it opens up a lot more options for you. Up to this point, you probably noticed that sport pilots can earn a lot of the same privileges that a private pilot can enjoy. But now let's look at a few more restrictions that apply to sport pilots. First things first, as a sport pilot, you cannot fly outside of the US unless you get prior permission from the country you're going to be flying in. Different countries don't use FAA rules, they use something called ICAO, and a sport pilot rating does not meet ICAO requirements that would allow you to fly in most other countries. Next, you cannot fly airplanes as an aircraft salesman to show the aircraft off to prospective buyers. In addition to this, you cannot carry any passengers in an event that's sponsored by a charitable organization. You also can't fly above 10,000 feet MSL. I guess they're afraid you're going to pass out if you go up there since most sport pilots don't have a medical certificate. In addition to this, you cannot fly if the visibility on the surface is less than 3 statute miles. And you also cannot fly without visual reference to the surface. As a private pilot, you could potentially operate under visual flight rules over the top of a ceiling as long as you maintain cloud clearances. But sport pilots are not allowed to do this. They must be able to see the surface at all times. And this is probably because sport pilots don't get any kind of instrument training, while a private pilot has to get at least 3 hours of instrument training before they can take their check ride. Under the new Mosaic rule, sport pilots are no longer limited to light sport aircraft, but they're still limited on some of the different aircraft that they can fly. Sport pilots are not permitted to operate aircraft that have a stall speed higher than 59 knots VS1, and this is referring to calibrated airspeed in the clean configuration. Sport pilots used to be limited by airspeed, but that's no longer the case. But you're not allowed to fly an airplane with more than 4 seats as a sport pilot. If you ever get an endorsement in something other than an airplane, you can only have 2 seats in those aircraft. Sport pilots also used to be limited by the weight of the aircraft, but this is gone as well with the new Mosaic rule. That being said, you technically are still limited by weight because sport pilots cannot earn type ratings. And if you remember from our lesson on required documents, a type rating is required anytime you operate an aircraft that weighs more than 12,500 pounds. Because of that, sport pilots cannot fly aircraft that weigh more than 12,500 pounds. Personally, I think that this is a good rule. Sport pilots also cannot operate an aircraft contrary to a limitation that is put on the airworthiness certificate of an aircraft. For example, experimental aircraft are not allowed to be operated over congested areas unless they meet certain requirements. This rule might seem like common sense, but I guess they figure that sport pilots don't go diving into the regulations too often. And just like this rule, you also cannot operate contrary to any limit that's been placed on your medical certificate or a limit that you've been given by your flight instructor. In addition to this, you cannot operate contrary to a restriction or limitation on your driver's license. So if you have a restriction for corrective lenses, you have to be wearing those when you go fly. Sport pilots are also not allowed to tow a glider. And last but not least, if the plane requires 2 pilots according to its type certificate, then a sport pilot cannot act as a required crew member. So no 737 MAX for you. Unless you're using Microsoft Flight Simulator. That's okay, I think. That being said, under the new Mosaic rule, there are a few things that you can do now. You can get endorsed to fly a high performance and complex aircraft. So you can fly airplanes with a variable pitch propeller and retractable landing gear. You can also earn a multi-engine rating as well, and that's pretty incredible to think about. Now you will need training and an endorsement to do this, but now it's an option for you under the new Mosaic rule. Speaking of endorsements, did you know that you're going to need an endorsement to take the Sport Pilot FAA written exam? I know it stinks, but the FAA requires this because the Sport Pilot test is pretty difficult. Now, you could pay an instructor to teach you all this stuff, but most instructors charge about $50 an hour for this training. You could also buy an online ground course, but these are usually around $300. Or you could get the premium version of this course for $50 at freepilottraining.net. This course uses these videos along with over 700 questions worth of practice tests and quizzes to make sure you're ready, and once you pass the course, I'll email you that endorsement and you'll be ready to go. So please consider this if you're thinking about getting your sport pilot rating. Not only can you help yourself by saving money, you're also making it possible for me to create more videos just like this for free. Now, before we move on, let's take a look at some of the restrictions that affects all pilots, including sport pilots. You'll find these in FAR 6131. Now, we've already discussed this a little bit, but some airplanes require a special type rating in order to act as the pilot in command of that particular aircraft. As you can see here, we must have a type rating to fly a large aircraft. Well, what the heck is a large aircraft? Once again, if you don't know the definition of something, a good place to start is FAR 1. This reg gives us a list of the definitions and abbreviations. And if we dig in here and look up the definition of a large aircraft, it looks like a large aircraft has a max certificated takeoff weight more than 12,500 pounds. So if it weighs more than 12,500 pounds or it has a turbojet engine, we need a type rating to operate that. In addition to that, there are a few other aircraft that the administrator has designated as needing a type rating. But honestly, I don't know any aircraft that fall into this category. Comment below if you know of one. But for you sport pilots, this means that you cannot fly these aircraft. But anyway, another restriction that you have as a sport pilot is that you cannot operate a complex aircraft without getting some additional training from an authorized instructor and receiving a logbook endorsement. Now, you might be wondering what the heck a complex aircraft is. And of course, the FAA likes to make things hard by not putting the definition in FAR 1. You have to look at the beginning of Part 61 to find the answer to that. There are a few additional definitions to different things up in FAR 61.1 as well. And this is actually where we can find out what a complex airplane is. As long as the airplane has retractable landing gear, flaps, and a controllable pitch propeller, they consider it a complex aircraft. Even if a computer controls the pitch of the propeller, the airplane still falls into this category. For example, on the C-130J, we don't control the pitch of the propellers. We have special computers called FADECs that take care of that for us. But I'd still call the C-130 a complex aircraft, wouldn't you? Now, one important thing to keep in mind about complex aircraft is that the horsepower of the engine doesn't matter. As long as it has retractable landing gear, flaps, and a controllable prop, it's a complex aircraft. And you need to have a special rating and an endorsement from an instructor in order to be able to fly one of these aircraft. There's nothing that says how long the training has to be, but if you're getting a complex endorsement, you can expect ground training on the different systems, and then the instructor has to make sure you're proficient in the airplane. He can also give you the flight training in a full flight simulator or a flight training device, as long as it meets all the requirements. And once he completes the training, he'll endorse your logbook and you're good to go. Okay, I just told you that horsepower doesn't matter for complex airplanes, but you also have a horsepower limit as well. In order to fly an aircraft with an engine that has more than 200 horsepower, you have to receive special training from an authorized instructor and get a logbook endorsement. Now, here's where things get weird. What if I was rated to fly a multi-engine land airplane and both engines were 200 horsepower exactly? Would I need to get this 200 horsepower endorsement? This is kind of a trick question, but the answer is no. The requirement is more than 200 horsepower per engine. So even though this plane has a total of 200 horsepower, we technically don't need the training or an endorsement. As long as we have our multi-engine endorsement as a sport pilot, we're good to go. But if I have even one engine that has 201 horsepower, I've got to get the appropriate ground and flight training and get the endorsement in my logbook from an authorized instructor. And just like the complex endorsement, this can be done in a simulator. One thing to keep in mind is that the complex and high performance endorsements are two different things. Just because I have a complex endorsement, that doesn't mean I can jump in a high performance aircraft. I've got to get a separate endorsement for that. I can receive the training at the same time in the same aircraft as long as it meets the requirements for both, but I still need to get both endorsements in my logbook to be legal. Another one I briefly want to mention is the tailwheel endorsement. If you learn to fly an aircraft with tricycle gear like a Cessna 172 or a Piper Cherokee, if you want to operate a tailwheel or conventional gear aircraft, you have to get some additional training and an endorsement. And there's a good reason for this. Tailwheels are a little different from the trikes you may have learned on. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the requirements you need to meet to operate as the pilot in command, and also what you need to do if you want to carry a passenger. As you may remember, your sport pilot certificate doesn't ever expire. But if you want to operate as the pilot in command of an aircraft, you need to get a flight review every 24 calendar months. Now, this isn't a check ride or anything like that. It's just a little ground and flight training to help you bust off the rust and make sure that you're safe and proficient as a pilot. You have to get at least 1 hour of ground instruction, and you have to have at least 1 hour of flight instruction to meet this requirement. And the instructor will endorse your logbook for another 24 calendar months. And in case you forgot, a calendar month just means that this endorsement expires on the last day of the month, 24 months after you took the training. I do want to mention that 1 hour of ground and 1 hour of flight instruction is the bare minimum. So don't be surprised if the instructor you choose requires a little bit more than that. It's always good to refresh on all that stuff you need to know as a sport pilot. And it's good to have an instructor challenge you with stuff in flight that you may not have worked on in quite a while to ensure that you improve and stay proficient. If you're trying to save a little money on your biannual flight review, instructors also have the option to assign you some ground lessons in the FAA Wings program, and they can use that instead of the ground training. But no matter what the case, you've got to fly with an instructor every 24 calendar months and get that endorsement if you want to be able to operate as the pilot in command. Now, if you do go overdue on your flight review, it's not a big deal. You just can't act as the pilot in command until you knock that out. You don't have to retake a check ride or anything crazy like that. As soon as you do the review and the instructor signs off that endorsement, you're good to go. But there is one other requirement that you need to meet if you want to carry a passenger, and we'll cover that in just a minute. With that in mind, there are a couple things that you can do instead of taking a biannual flight review. If you happen to pass another practical exam or you pass a proficiency check to add on another rating, this resets the clock on your flight review. Let's say I passed a proficiency check that allowed me to add night flying to my sport pilot privileges 1 year after I got my sport pilot license. If I passed a proficiency check on March 10th, I would need a flight review on March 31st, 24 months from the date I passed that proficiency check. Unless, of course, I decided to move on and take another proficiency check, or I decided to get my private pilot's license. If I pass one of these, this would reset the clock again. Okay, so if you have a current biennial flight review, this allows you to operate as the pilot in command of an aircraft. But if you want to carry a passenger, there's also some currency requirements that you have to meet. You'll find these requirements in FAR 6157. If you want to carry a passenger when you go fly, before you can do that, you need to have done 3 takeoffs and landings in the same category and class of aircraft in the last 90 days. As I've discussed in the past, category and class would be like airplane single engine land, or airplane single engine sea, or multi engine sea. I can't do my takeoffs and landings in a multi engine land airplane, then take a passenger up in a single engine land airplane if I'm not current in the single engine land airplane. Before I can take my passenger up, I need to go accomplish 3 takeoffs and landings by myself or with an instructor. Now, during the day, these can be touch and goes if you want, or full stop landings. The one exception to this rule is if you're flying a tailwheel aircraft. Those takeoffs and landings have to be to a full stop. If you get your tailwheel endorsement, you'll find that slower airspeeds and taxiing are usually where new pilots tend to struggle. So to carry a passenger in a tailwheel, you have to completely stop the aircraft before you make the next takeoff. Okay, so another requirement you need to be aware of is if you want to carry passengers at night. Once again, sport pilots have to have a medical and an endorsement to be able to do this, but if you want to be able to carry someone around at night, the daytime takeoff and landing currencies won't work. You have to get 3 takeoffs and landings at night within the last 90 days. And these takeoffs and landings cannot be touch and goes. They have to be full stop landings no matter what type of aircraft you're flying. And once again, these takeoffs and landings have to be in the same category and class of aircraft. Now, once you start flying more regularly, you'll notice that the night currency is a lot harder to keep up with. In fact, I fly the C-130 at night quite a bit more than small training planes, and I have to regularly check my logbook to make sure I'm current to take passengers up in a Cessna 172 at night because the C-130 is a multi-engine land airplane. Just because my currency is good in a multi-engine land airplane, that doesn't make me current in a single-engine land airplane. I still need to jump in and do 3 takeoffs and 3 full stop landings at night to be legal, and take a passenger with me if I haven't had 3 takeoffs and landings at night in the last 90 days. The reason for this is because night landings are just a little bit trickier, and the visual cues are a little bit different than what you're used to during the day. But if you're current in a certain category and class of aircraft at night, you're also current during the day as well. But if you want to take a passenger with you at night, you have to do those currencies at night. Okay, this brings up an important question. What are we calling night? And what time do we have to do these takeoffs and landings to a full stop if we want them to legally count? To make things easy on us, the FAA has made the definition as simple as possible here in 6157. For the purpose of night currency, you have to have 3 takeoffs and landings to a full stop from 1 hour after sunset until 1 hour before sunrise. So if you want to know the exact time that the sun sets or rises, you can literally Google search it and find the answer in about 15 seconds. It looks like the sun sets here exactly 5:12 p.m. And if I want to go accomplish my currency at night, I need to wait until at least 6:12 p.m. That's 18:12 for my friends on 24-hour time. Then it looks like the sun rises at 7:32 here today, so I could wake up early if I want and knock those out anytime before 6:30. With that in mind, almost every other reg uses something a tiny bit different to determine the legal definition for night. If we look back in FAR 1, we can get the exact definition. It says here that night means the time between the end of evening civil twilight and the beginning of morning civil twilight, as published in the Air Almanac, converted to local time. I'll be the first to admit that the Air Almanac is probably the most boring book of all time. And to be honest, it's a little bit tricky to read, but typically you'll find that evening civil twilight occurs about 30 minutes after sunset, and morning civil twilight occurs about 30 minutes before sunrise. The exact time depends on your latitude and the time of year. The easiest way to find the exact time is to Google search civil twilight in the city where you are and use a website like this right here if you need that information. As you can see here, today in Veneta, Oklahoma, sunset is at 17:11 local and civil twilight begins at 17:40. Then sunrise will be at 7:31 local and civil twilight ends at 7:02. And as you can tell, it's roughly 30 minutes, but it's not exact. That's why for the purpose of takeoff and landing currency, they made it an hour, so there's no confusion whatsoever. You can just Google the sunset time, and if you're going to have a passenger with you 1 hour after sunset, you need to make sure that you're night current before you do that. Okay, there's one more thing I want to discuss today, and this might be the most important part of today's lesson. I'd mentioned this regulation in other videos, but I want to bring it back up to show you something. In FAR 91-103, it says, each pilot in command shall, before beginning a flight, become familiar with all available information concerning that flight. Remember, you're training to be the pilot in command. Now, it goes on to mention the mandatory pre-flight information that you have to know before every flight. But I want to give you an acronym that will help you remember everything you need to check or know before the flight. WANT. Weather. This one is super obvious. You need to make sure that you're going to be legal and safe when you go fly. If you don't know your weather minimums, I've got some videos to help you learn what those are. And as a sport pilot, you need to make sure that you're only flying when the weather's VFR with visibility 3 statute miles or better. Sport pilots cannot earn an instrument rating or fly in the weather. Alternate plan and activate flight plan. For VFR, you technically don't need to file an alternate airport because you should only be flying when the weather is good. But it's always smart to have a backup plan if the weather's marginal at your landing destination. Then, of course, if you want to file a flight plan, be sure to activate that. As you know, you can do that in the air, but I recommend doing as much on the ground as you can before you leave. NOTAMs. Check the NOTAMs. This includes the NOTAMs at your takeoff and landing destination, and the NOTAMs in between. I have a video that goes into a lot more detail on NOTAMs coming up in this series, but NOTAMs are one of the mandatory things that you must know before you take off. Takeoff and landing data. I call this TOLD because if you turn takeoff and landing data into a little acronym, it makes another word and it makes you sound way cooler when you use it in front of your friends. Anyway, you're required to know the runway lengths at airports of intended use. And you're also required to know if you have enough runway. I went into excruciating detail on this in my video on performance. If you need more information on that, you'll want to watch that video too. For the S, this really doesn't apply to sport pilots, it's an instrument thing. It stands for SIDS and stars, but you won't need to know that unless you go on and get your private and instrument pilot rating. Now, the one thing that isn't in my fancy little WANTS acronym is something that's just common sense. Fuel. You'll find the VFR fuel requirements in FAR 91-151. According to this, no person may begin a flight in an airplane under VFR conditions unless, considering the wind and forecast weather conditions, there's enough fuel to fly to the first point of intended landing and assuming normal cruising speed. During the day, we need to land with at least 30 minutes of fuel reserves. At night, we need to land with at least 45 minutes of fuel reserves. And this definition of night is talking about the normal legal definition of night. This would be the evening civil twilight to morning civil twilight. And once again, that's roughly 30 minutes before sunrise and 30 minutes after sunset. Anyway, hopefully you can remember your fuel requirements without an acronym. But I guess if you want, you could just use FWANTS, or you can just be a pilot and remember it. I hope you enjoyed today's video on the privileges and limitations that sport pilots have. In the next video, we're going to be discussing some of the regulations that will keep you safe when you go fly. That video is going to be right here when you guys are ready for that. Thanks for watching. See ya!